Well, good afternoon if you are in New York City or Newburyport, Massachusetts, or somewhere in the wilds of New Jersey, or anywhere in North and South America where it's the early afternoon. Good morning to people further west from us. Good evening to people listening all around the world in places such as Seville, in Paris, especially in Ukraine, where our loved ones, we want you to stay strong, be strong. My guest today, and greetings in Africa and all around the world. My guest today on Fred Plotkin on Fridays, which is, by the way, on Idagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Idagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera and theater available to music lovers all around the world. My guest today is Brendan Pelsue, a playwright, a librettist, a translator, a professor of playwriting at Rutgers University. We met at a New York Philharmonic concert that he was attending with his wife. We got into immediate conversation because I liked his shirt and I'm not shy, and I asked him about his shirt. And that led to all kinds of conversations. And we found a lot of commonality of interest and belief in what we care about. And I have wanted to have a playwright on my program for a while to talk specifically about the art of writing plays, but also writing libretti. And when I discovered that Brendan does both and is a translator to boot, he seemed the perfect person to have along. So Brendan, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Sure. So I decided to do something a little different with Brendan than I do with a lot of my guests, most of whom I say, pick things from the Adagio catalog where you love the music, where you love the opera. I specifically said with Brendan, give me 5 operas where you think it has a great libretto. And so we're going to speak today about the libretti and also about the art of writing libretti, what the requirements are. And I want Brendan to share his knowledge of this. I'm going to go not chronologically. I'm not going to go in the list order that you gave me. I'm just going to pick what I want to pick. But I am going to start with Don Giovanni.
Great.
By Mozart, libretto by Lorenzo da Ponte. It premiered in 1787 in Prague. It was a huge hit. Part of why I'm asking for this, Brendan, is that you recently did a translation of Moliere's Don Juan. Now, we should specify the story of Don Juan does not just belong to one playwright or one librettist. It's kind of a universal story that is told and told again. And we are told that the Da Ponte adaptation came from Tirso de Molina, a play from 1630, I believe, El Burlador de Sevilla, Il Convidado de Pietra. In other words, the Burlador, I don't know quite how to translate that from the Spanish. He's sort of the smart aleck from Seville, maybe?
Yeah, the smart aleck, the gadabout,
The gadabout, okay,
yeah.
And the stone guest, in other words, what we now call in the opera the commendatore. What is it about the Da Ponte libretto that you particularly admire in Don Giovanni?
Well, one of the reasons I put that down is the way that it kind of makes. So you're right. The Don Giovanni myth is really old, right? And it there's the Molina play, there's the Moliere play, but even before that, it sort of exists in legend and is, I think, sort of similar to the Faust myth in the sense that it's not quite clear where it comes from, but it sort of emerges and then everybody seems to know it. But one of the things that I like about the Da Ponte libretto is the way that it takes a lot of things that are sort of vague in the myth and kind of makes them specific and sort of gives Don Giovanni or Don Juan this set of sort of specific misdeeds and a particular family that he's kind of running from that is sort of closing the noose or the knot around him at the end of his life because he's killed the father of this woman who he's seduced. And in the Moliere play, which I actually also really enjoy and did this translation of, all of these things are much vaguer. So you know that he's killed this sort of commander colonel figure, and you know that he's seduced and jilted this woman, but what their relationship is not totally clear. Everything just kind of exists as these sort of separate or maybe connected entities. And I'm kind of interested in the way that the Da Ponte libretto, I don't know, maybe gives sort of dramatic unity to the story.
So I love that an opera that I claim to know really well, Don Giovanni, you just described in a way that I've never thought about. Namely, the family closing in on him and him trying to escape. Number one, I don't think of them as a family at all. I think of them as people in civil society of different classes, and even Anna is of a different class from Elvira, not to mention
that's true.
Helena and all the others. And I don't see them as related, and I see them as having their own agendas and their own interests, and the Don is a lightning rod for them to act upon their own interests, and that successfully or not. So that, for example, I mean, what I love about the libretto, among many things in the opera, is I think of it as being vague, in that we don't know at the very beginning of the opera what Anna and Giovanni are doing, because it's off stage. Whatever is happening, we hear in the music, kind of like Rosenkavalier, but we don't see it. So therefore, is he raping her?
Right.
Are they having consensual sex? Are they having any sex at all? Is she coming on to him and he's resisting her? Not likely, but we never know. Because from the very beginning of the opera, what's happening off stage, we don't know. The whole opera is the trajectory of what ifs. And it goes from one to the next to the next. And then Elvira shows up. And Elvira, we get the feeling, has been romantically, sexually with Giovanni before and wants to again.
Yes.
And he finds her an annoyance. Now, I've worked on many productions of this opera, and I wrote a book, Opera 101, which is a popular textbook, and I teach 11 operas in the book. The fifth one I teach is Don Giovanni, not the first. I think that I have to use 4 operas, which are Rigoletto, Tosca, Lucia di Lammermoor, and The Barber of Seville, to even lead up to teaching Don Giovanni. It is, in my experience, along with Le Nozze di Figaro, the hardest opera to direct. If you cast it and there's one cast change, everything changes about the chemistry of the performance. And so what happens is, if you have an Elvira who is indignant as opposed to stupid, as opposed to oversexed, and there's nothing wrong with being oversexed in my view, but if she happens to be playing it oversexed, that's a different thing from an Elvira who just feels she's wronged. If you have an Anna who may, in her mind, as the performer, have had sex with Giovanni and liked it, and then feels abandoned, and then feels conflicted because Giovanni, after you've had sex with him, just killed your father, that's a whole trajectory. Do you direct the opera so that Anna is the lead female, or do you direct the opera that Elvira is the lead female? If you direct with one or the other, it's a whole other story. And to me, it's like a prism. If you turn it slightly, if you have a Leporello who's sexier than the Don, as opposed to one who's sort of a Sancho Panza, it's a different experience than if you have a Don who is absolutely glamorous and a Leporello who's servile. And what I love is that we can overlay onto Da Ponte's libretto all of these factors, never mind the conductor who brings the music, which is the most important thing, and it becomes an entirely different opera. And more than any opera I can think of, this is the one that changes every single time I see it, every single time I work on it, every single time I study it, because it's just always something new. And so I want to ask you, I'm not challenging you, but I want to embrace your concept of the man trying to escape from the family that's closing in.
Well, I guess what I mean specifically is just sort of even thinking about, right, Donna Anna, whose father, Don Giovanni, kills at
Yes.
the beginning, right? And that this is sort of a crime that chases him throughout the opera, right? In the Moliere play, you sort of know that this kind of commander figure has been killed, and you also know that he's seduced. There's only one woman in the Moliere play, so it's Donna Elvira and Donna Anna are sort of a composite character. But what this woman's relationship is to this murder that has occurred is not clear at all. Whether she's the daughter of this person, whether she just lives in the same town, even really where they are. And so I guess what I was sort of thinking, because I think you're right that the opera is sort of in a way kind of radically open, right? It's sort of different each time that you do it. But when I was working on my Moliere translation, I was looking at all of these other versions of the Don Juan myth, including Don Giovanni. And it felt like in Don Giovanni, the sort of looser ends are just that much more sort of tied up, but there's just a little bit more causality around, why is the Don sort of meeting his end at this particular moment after having, wronged this particular set of people, that sort of thing. Whereas the Moliere play, it's not even clear sometimes that cause and effect is operating at all. I mean, it feels like a really sort of radical text in that way. And it's, partly I think that's because he had to write it in a hurry. He wrote it in about 3 weeks to replace Tartuffe, which had just been closed. And then, Don Juan also got closed and censored shortly after it opened. But so I think that for me, it's I maybe sort of come at it from the relative position of sort of having spent all this time with this sort of even vaguer version of the myth, or this even more open version of the
And
myth.
here's an important point for our listeners to fasten on. And by the way, I want to point out that when you and I met, within 10 minutes of our conversation, I blurted out that I loved Moliere even before I learned that you were just done a translation.
Yeah.
He happens to be on my very short list of great creative artists, and therefore I love everything about Moliere. But the main difference, I think, between a play and an opera, where the text may be similar, is that opera has the restriction of music, which
Yeah.
sounds like a terrible thing to say, but you have to be in a certain place and time and moment because of the music, not because of the words. So
Yeah.
that if you are acting the role of Don Juan in a Moliere version or any number of versions, you can pause for 5 whole minutes if you want. It would be boring on the stage, but you can pause if you want to.
Yeah.
Whereas the music in the opera, any opera, will not permit you to pause. And you have to keep going because the music says keep going. And what this opera and a lot of operas of that time frame had is recitative. Recitare comes from the Italian to act, to speak, to recite, but it's really about acting. And recitativo is often put on a musical cadence. And the very good singers who can do recitative well make sense out of the words. They're not just going through it because it's in the notes, but because they're saying something and they're communicating something. If you're playing, for example, Zerlina, who is attracted to this handsome or at least charismatic man, and who obviously is many stations above her in terms of social rank, which is something that mattered more then than perhaps now. I hope so. But nonetheless, her recitativo would be a little hesitant, a little nervous, whereas his would be suave and commanding because his social rank gives him that. And that's something that a singer and her or his coach have to invest in their study. But then there are arias, obviously.
Yeah.
And the arias are the emotional expansion of a moment. So if someone sings Mi tradì quell'alma ingrata, he betrayed me, that horrible guy, that soul that ungrateful soul. But the music is used to explore her feelings of what it's like to be betrayed. I think also Da Ponte, we need to know more about him, namely that he was born Jewish in 1749 in the Veneto, in the part of the area that is north of Venice in the Italian Alps and the Dolomites. His father had 3 sons. His wife died pretty early, and he converted his sons to Catholicism from Judaism. And Da Ponte for a while was a priest, but did not let that get in the way of his having quite the love life in Venice and fathering children until he was banned from the Venetian Republic for 15 years. He traveled north to Germany. I forget which town, but it led to his meeting Salieri and going to Vienna, where he lived, and that's where he met Mozart. And how he acquired his natural gift for writing words that had a duality. I think part of what I love in the libretto is that most plays, most books that we read tend to be straightforward in their narrative. We can find subtleties in them, but in the case of Da Ponte, in the 3 operas, in Così fan tutte, Le nozze di Figaro, and Don Giovanni, there's so much duality. If you say it one way, it means one thing. If you say it the other way, it means another. Mozart understood that completely and reflected that in the music, which is why those 3 operas are just so extraordinary. When Mozart died, well, actually before that, in 1790, when Franz Joseph died and Leopold became the new emperor, Da Ponte was out of favor. So Da Ponte began to look elsewhere for work. He met another woman. I'm making a very long story short. He wound up in New York. When Mozart
New
died,
York.
he
I did
and
not
his
know
wife,
that.
you didn't know this. Okay, I have a
No.
gift for you then, my friend. He wound up in New York and became the first professor of Italian at what was then known as King's College, but is now Columbia University. And his wife said to him, you can leave the furniture, you can leave most of the clothes, bring your books. You're going to need your books. So Da Ponte brought this wonderful collection of his own writings plus Italian classics, and they became part of the collection at what used to be known as the Casa Italiana, the Institute of Italian Studies of Columbia University. I studied at Columbia, and because I spoke Italian, having lived in Italy, I got a job at the Casa Italiana as custodian, librarian, whatever. And one of the great thrills of my life was being able to read all of the Ponte's books that he brought to the States and brought to New York. They no longer are in the Casa Italiana. They're in the precious book collection of the Library of Columbia University. But you, as a scholar, can go and look at these books that are there. So it was Da Ponte who brought Italian language instruction to the United States. It was Da Ponte who staged the first Don Giovanni in the United States in New York in 1825. It was Da Ponte who introduced Rossini operas to the United States. It was Da Ponte who imported singers from Europe who he knew Spanish and Italian mostly to New York. And the seeds of Italian opera in New York City are thanks to Lorenzo da Ponte. So, and because of that, fast forward, we have the Metropolitan Opera, we have opera in the United States. We can thank him for a lot in terms of America's musical culture and heritage. Now, back to the opera. It has 2 acts. It has 17 scenes. When you are staging an opera with 17 scenes that are courtyards and balconies and nighttime settings and graveyards and a dinner table and perhaps hell or some version thereof, and then an open field that is not described in terms of its aspect, you have to stage a production in which you can create these scenes, but there's no stopping because the music hurtles forth miraculously. And therefore, I want to ask you as a playwright, how do you conceive a work in terms of its settings? If we were to think of Ibsen plays, they tend to be in one room and then
Right.
maybe a public space, and then maybe the people may be a private, like an office, a doctor's office, a newspaper office, then a public room. In other Ibsen plays, they are by the sea, you don't change the scenery much. Eugene O'Neill could be set in a bar.
Yeah.
Tennessee Williams could be set in a home or a garden or whatever. But in opera, the settings change constantly, and few with more rapidity than Don Giovanni.
Mhm.
17 scenes, 2 acts, and all kinds of locations at all hours of the day and night. How would you, if you were doing a new libretto for the story of Don Juan, would you be constrained by having to do different scenic effects than what the opera Don Giovanni calls for?
It's a great question, and I think it would really depend on the production, and if I knew that I were writing for a particular production with a particular director, then you would probably arrive at some kind of production concept together. That would be either, maybe you would be in some very abstracted space, right? Maybe you would just, so for instance, in the translation of Moliere's Don Juan that I did, we didn't end up doing this. We ended up doing something that was a little bit more sort of representational, where you had began in sort of a private room, and then we're at the beach, and then we're at Don Juan's house. But we sort of thought about, well, what if it were a kind of abstracted space where what you had was sort of the detritus of Western civilization all around you, some sort of, graveyard of civilization. And here he is wandering around and wreaking havoc. And then we come to understand that what's literally on the stage is not what's kind of narratively where the story is taking place. But I think as a playwright, I always ask myself two questions about these things. One is kind of, what is the point at which the play or the dramatic text or the opera stops offering the audience a literal representation and asks for their imagination to take over, right? Asks for them to imagine that we're by the seaside, or that we're in Nora's living room in a dollhouse, or that we're wherever it is that we are and what that space is like. And when do you sort of give them something actual? And part of that interest for me actually came out of a real sort of time that I spent in graduate school reading a lot of Japanese no drama and becoming really interested in the way that those plays will use a really abstracted language, right? So somebody will turn a small wheel or a circle, and you'll understand that this has been a journey of 100 miles that somebody has taken, right? But that journey lives partly in this act that you've seen on the stage, but it lives partly in your imagination as a viewer. And I think that one of the things that's really powerful about live performing art, whether it's an opera or a play or whatever, is that there's both something that's happening in my interior as an individual audience member that is, my sort of imagining with what's happening on stage. And also there's something that's happening collectively, because we're all receiving, whatever it is that's being represented. And I think that being conscious about that can be really exciting when you're writing a drama and sort of thinking about that moment. But then the other thing is that if you have designers who you really trust, right? Stage designers and, set designers, lighting designers. One of the things that I love about working for the theater is that, I work primarily in language, and that's kind of where my imagination lives. But then you get to talk with and collaborate with all of these people whose imaginations sort of begin where mine end, right? So I might have this idea that it's possible to have 17 separate scenes really quickly, either through, the bad version would be a series of backdrops that just keep flopping down or something like that, or through some kind of more sophisticated gesture. But I have no idea how to pull that off. But then you find some incredible designer and they find a container for your imagination and sort of in interaction with your imagination in a way that's really exciting. So I also find that the longer I write and the longer that I work in the theater, the more I have that sense of sort of what I don't know, but can pass over to somebody else to figure out.
So your comment triggered many responses to me. I'll name two. One of them is, when you studied Japanese theater, did
Mm.
you ever study the work, the writings of a professor named A.C. Scott?
No, I didn't.
No, okay. So I'm considerably older than you are. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin, they at that time had the leading department of Asian theater
Hmm.
in the United States, and it was headed by a very annoying man named A.C. Scott, who had his devotees and had his doubters, and I suppose I was one of his doubters. This is not to take down what he did,
Yeah.
but his view of theater was that the actor's ego had to be destroyed, and it had to be replaced by I don't know what. And it's not that I'm saying that my ego should not be destroyed. I don't think anyone's ego should be destroyed to play a role in a play.
Yeah.
But he focused more on masks, which goes back to the Greeks.
Mhm.
He focused more on movement and gesture than word. And I was in a production that he did of Beckett's Waiting for Godot in the NOH theater style. And you might want to go back and read his writings. He was very provocative, and
Write
it's
that down.
A.C. Scott, not A.O.
Yeah.
Scott, the film critic for the New York Times, but A.C.
Right.
Scott. And he was very revolutionary in his time for the United States.
Mm.
And at that time, the University of Wisconsin had a very good theater program because it embraced things that the only other school that did that was Yale.
Hmm.
Because there were training schools such as Carnegie Mellon that had very formal acting programs, very good ones, NYU, there are many. But it was Yale and Wisconsin that in many ways, when I was considering college, I considered Yale and Wisconsin actually. And picked Wisconsin for a couple of reasons, but they both had outstanding European history departments, and I knew that for opera, I wanted to study European history. For my particular interest, Madison had better professors than Yale did. If I wanted to do British history, I think I would have gone to Yale. But for what I wanted, it was better at Madison. The departments both had excellent physical training programs for the actor, for the designer, for the director. Wisconsin had a broadcasting school that Yale did not. And I was interested in radio plays and narrative and so on, going beyond the theater. But also Wisconsin had an exchange program with the University of Bologna, where Italy's Juilliard is, and I would go there and study for that. So as part of my training, I had to do this Asian theater course with Professor A.C. Scott. And it was very interesting because it ran counter to everything I learned about, quote, Western theater. And I don't like to divide East and West and North and South. It's world theater. But nonetheless, his ideas were very interesting. So that's number one. Number two, you use the word imagination in talking about where the audience members, and I would say also the performers, have to go. Correct me if you think I'm wrong, I think imagination is in short supply nowadays. I think what we have now is what I call digital consensus, which I only coined right now for you, but I like the term. Digital consensus, meaning that if we find a unity online or in some virtual space of what we seem to agree is hot, a meme of the moment, that's more important than using your imagination to take you places that only you can go when you're listening to an abstraction such as music, when you're watching dance, when you are looking at a painting, whether it's a realistic painting of a cow in a meadow or whether it's an abstract painting, and certainly the theater, where the active audience member brings his or her engagement and imagination to experience something. You and I were at a concert with your wife, and they played Stravinsky, and we didn't talk after because I had to dash, but I'll bet the three of us had very different responses to the Stravinsky. I would bet on that.
I'm sure.
Yeah, and we can talk about that another time. But my concern about the performing arts in general is the lack of imagination brought by members of the audience. And
Mhm.
therefore, in a lot of ways, how theater artists and opera artists feel they have to create things that are literal. You know, when people
Mm.
say, as I hear all the time, I couldn't believe that about him or her, you know, why did Elvira come back when Giovanni was, you know, so bad to her?
Right.
Well, maybe because she liked the sex, maybe because she was lonely, maybe because she had her issues. He certainly has his awful issues, but we need to think about what they are and use our imagination to imagine what they are, not by bringing our own values, but trying to understand his values or his lack of values, and without moralizing, which is
Mhm.
another thing where we bring our values of now and superimpose them on the values of ancient Greece, of Shakespeare's time, of France, of wherever, Japan. There are human values and the noble human values that we can describe, whether they're, you know, the commandments, whether they are the nobility of Shakespeare and Schiller and Goethe and so on, um, or the reality of human frailty, which we see throughout the theater and throughout history, and that's part of what we love about the theater.
Mhm.
Um, do you agree with me or disagree with me about imagination in our current times?
Well, I think that I do, if I'm understanding you correctly, in the sense that I feel like we live in a media landscape where so much is provided to us, right? Very little is sometimes asked of me in order to consume, you know, a show on Netflix or something like that, right? Sort of everything is provided, the sounds, the movement, the all of it. And also I think actually a sort of a certain amount of lack of ambiguity in you know, kind of how the narrative is structured. And I was thinking about this recently with, I don't even remember what the show was that I was watching, but I realized that I didn't have to look at the screen, and the amount that was stated in the dialogue meant that I understood every beat and rhythm and also actually piece of subtext, you know. And I guess what I feel, what I'm most excited about, especially if it's live art, but also if it's cinema, is art that asks something of me in some way, in the sense that it requires me to participate with, like we're saying, the imagination, right? And it requires me to bring a kind of presence and questioning and openness to what the work of art is or is
Mhm.
trying to do. And you know, one of the reasons that I sometimes like to go hear music, right? Go hear the Philharmonic, like where we ran into each other, is that if I don't really bring that sense of presence and sort of tune in and kind of require myself to show up for the music, I can just spend the whole time thinking about my grocery list, which is a real waste of time, right? But you sort of either you have to show up and sort of be there and be present with the thing, or it's going to totally pass you by. Whereas I think that there is a fair bit right now that we can sort of passively consume. I can be thinking about my grocery list and getting every beat of the TV show, and I'm not sure that that's ideal.
You obviously are way too young to have heard Ethel Merman, one of the great Broadway divas of all time. But one of her most famous numbers was Rose's Turn, which is the 11 o'clock number, the climax number of Gypsy,
Oh, sure.
one of
Yeah.
the greatest Broadway shows ever. And I used to live in the same building as Ethel Merman, and I had a relative who performed at a show in Gypsy with her for
Mm.
2.5 years. So she and I had a conversation every so often, and she was very blunt. And by the way, I commend to readers and listeners the biography of Ethel Merman by Brian Kellow, Kellow. It's excellent. And Merman, I asked her, what were you thinking about when you do Rose's Turn every night? And she would say, well, honey, sometimes I was thinking about who I was going to have dinner with after the show. And as often as not, I do my grocery list. And I said, while you were doing Rose's Turn, she said, yeah, I did it so many times, I could do it in my sleep. And
That's amazing.
the audience never knew that.
Right.
But because she was a riveting presence, she was not to everyone's taste, but she was undeniably arresting and charismatic, kind of like Birgit Nielsen in the opera, that, she was just a phenomenon unto herself. I
Mm.
don't think Birgit Nielsen ever did her grocery list while singing the Liebestod. Anyway,
No, but it's also, I think that also raises an interesting question about audience versus performer, right? And the way that I may have had a whole sort of imaginative life watching Ethel Merman sing Rose's Turn, right? That obviously had nothing to do with her groceries or my groceries. But then yeah, this person who is doing this 8 times a week is sort of, yeah, thinking about the bus route and whatever. And I think that that's also really interesting, right? And it's also sort of makes us ask questions about some of our assumptions of acting, right? Does this person need to be experiencing what the character is experiencing for me to also experience it? And I don't know
so
the answer to that.
when she was saying "Ready or Not, Here Comes Mama," what she was thinking was, I want a loin of pork tonight.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, the magic of the theater we've just
We've
destroyed
ruined it.
3,000 years.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's go on to the next opera,
Yeah.
which goes back in time a bit. You picked an opera I just adore, so very happy you picked it. Agrippina by
Yeah.
Handel. And it has a libretto by, and I wrote it down, Cardinal Vincenzo Grimani, who lived from 1652 or 5 to 1710. And he was a cardinal. So we had Lorenzo da Ponte, who was a priest, although he fathered kids and so on. Cardinal Grimani had a similar biography there, that he did not let his papal or his church presence get in the way of his love life. Um, he was living in Venice. He was born in either Mantua or Venice, but he was living in Venice. He was from a wealthy family and he owned a theater. And therefore, he could write things that would be produced in his theater. And at that time, Georg Friedrich Handel was a young man from northern Germany who arrived in Venice to learn the craft of making opera, because Venice was the undisputed capital of opera in the world at that time. And he wrote a couple of operas, operas in Venice. The last one, and probably the masterpiece, being Agrippina, which meant that Grimani would have met Handel. They would have conceived this opera together. Grimani, who was very political and aligned not with the existing Pope, Clement XI, but with rivals in the Habsburg family in Austria, basically used Agrippina as a veiled criticism of the political establishment in Rome, which was at that time the Catholic Church, because it was not the nation of Italy. Venice was an empire. Rome, the Vatican was its own empire in its way. And throughout northern Italy, there were duchies in Milan and Mantua and Bologna and Parma and so forth, and Ferrara. And so therefore, what this opera is about in a lot of ways is a veiled criticism of the corruption, of the sex scandals happening in the Catholic Church. And it's a story often told of Agrippina. We usually hear it from the story of Claudius and Nero, Claudius being her husband, Nero being her degenerate son.
Yeah.
And then there was Poppaea, who was this Brigitte Bardot character, and I'm not making this up because there was a film from 1956 in which Alberto Sordi played Nero, Brigitte Bardot played Poppaea, and Gloria Swanson in Italian played Agrippina. It
Oh,
has
I've
to
got
be
to see that. That
it
sounds
has to
amazing.
be seen.
Yeah, that is not
It-
people you imagine in the same.
no, and it's intended to be a comedy, and it sort of is. It's like an Italian sex farce set in ancient Rome, except the Gloria Swanson is a very determined Norma Desmond, Sunset Boulevard kind of self-deluding character
Hmm.
as Agrippina, and it was perfectly cast. And I love that this opera, Agrippina, is told from the story of Nero's mother
Yeah.
rather than Nero Nerone, as he's known, or Claudius or Poppeo, who were the characters who typically got the attention. Monteverdi did the coronation of Poppaea. There were many operas about Claudius. There were a few operas about Nero. Their stories are often told, but when you tell it from the point of view of the mother who has been wronged, and in fact, even her own son in the end is tired of her and he disposes of her, basically. Um, it's a thrilling opera also because when I looked it up in preparation for our conversation, I found that it was presented as a drama. But when it was
Hmm.
done a few years ago at the Metropolitan Opera, it was presented as a comedy.
Hmm.
Do you think of it as a comedy or a drama?
I guess, well, I primarily know it through that Metropolitan production. That's when I first saw it, because my brother works as an assistant director at the Metropolitan,
Ah,
and he worked on that production.
okay.
And so most of my lots of my opera going has to do with whatever he is working on at any given moment,
Yeah.
because I want to see what he's doing. And I knew lots of other Handel music, but I didn't know that opera. And when I saw it, I certainly thought it worked as a comedy. I
Mhm.
experienced it as a comedy. But there's a way that I also experienced it kind of fraying at the limits of genre in a way that felt really interesting because I think you're right that it's clearly this veiled critique of the politics of that time, but it feels like of power and sort of how it works at any time. But at the same time, some of the music that people like Agrippina and Nerone have is so beautiful that you find yourself being sort of transported by these things that they want that are not good things to want. And I found all of that really interesting. And I actually found that the thing that it kept reminding me of was Brecht, in the sense that it's this kind of epic political tale that is really sort of playing with your empathy in strange ways and sort of defying genre. And also like Brecht in the sense that I sometimes wondered if the sort of, I don't know, sometimes when I watch a Brecht play, when I watch something like Mother Courage, right, I feel like you can feel a tension that he felt as a writer between directing this critique of war profiteering or of kind of false ideology, and then just really empathizing with these people who he's created, right? And so then you sort of feel that as an audience member, where you're not quite sure how to feel about these people who you see on stage. And I know, I mean, obviously the aims of that opera and the aims of Brecht are really different, and the two moments that led to those, two works are really different. But talking just sort of as a viewer who gets to collapse time and space and have my private imaginative experience, like we're talking about, that connects to all my past imaginative experiences. That was what I really kept thinking of. And going in thinking that I was going to see this Handel opera about, Roman history and Nero and Claudius, that is not what I thought that I was going to think. And so, and part of that I think is the libretto and the way that the story is structured, and the way that you sort of have these different, it almost feels like episodes, like a sort of a picaresque, and that's maybe part of what lends it to comedy, right? If it were sort of a unified dramatic action in an Aristotelian sense, you might
Mhm.
feel like it was much more something like a tragedy. And all of that just felt really exciting to me, and really, I guess I'm always excited when something is not what I expect, and when I leave thinking more than I thought I would.
And again, that brings up the issue that should be obvious, but it's not, is that you brought your imagination.
Yes, yeah.
Again, when I attended that 5 times, and I did a lecture before the HT because I
Uh-huh.
adored it, um, I found a lot of people said, well, you know, it doesn't relate to now, as
Hmm.
if that's a requirement of a work created in 1710, but it
Right.
it doesn't relate to now. I believe it completely does, but
Oh,
also
yeah.
just this to me, I've said to, well, I won't say the name of the company, but a major company, that I would love to be involved in a project in which we stage both the Incoronazione di Poppea by Monteverdi with Agrippina, because
Hmm.
they're the same characters in
Hmm.
effect, but presented so differently, except that both were attacks on the political structure in Venice and in Rome. In the
Yeah.
case of Poppea, it's about the politics and the corruption of Venice, whereas Agrippina, even though the characters are all Roman, Agrippina was about the Vatican in 1710, as
Mm.
opposed to 1641 with the Monteverdi. But the fact that the same characters can be used allegorically about our current world means that we can look at these characters, and I'm just going to say name once and leave it there, Donald Trump. And there's
Yeah.
plenty to fill in there with, the daughters and the sons and the wives and all that. And I would never, ever, ever create an Orange Claudius. And,
No.
I would never make Donald Trump Jr. Nero. I would never do that. And I would never
No.
make Melania Agrippina. But the point is, someone would and be cheating to do that. I would instead do the best production of Agrippina. And then people say, gee, that reminds me of people we know today. And not, it could be the Putin family, it could be any family in power that rules corruptly.
Yeah.
Erdogan, you name it. It could be anywhere. It could be the British royal family. I don't care.
Yeah.
With redheaded Prince Harry. It's all there
Yeah.
because the dynamics of family and power struggles, the Murdoch family, it's all there, and it goes back to the house of Agamemnon. This is part of great drama and comedy sometimes. And
Yeah.
therefore, we do not have to underline, but I always want to shake people and say, it's about human nature and behavior, which to me changes somewhat, but not too much.
Yeah.
The essentials are the essentials, whether we like them or not, they are there. And part of what drama and comedy address is the subtleties of this behavior played out in different kinds of formats.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. And I think, I mean, one way that I think about it is that I relate to now, right? So I don't always need the production to relate to now, because I'm very qualified to sort of decide if this person reminds me of Donald Trump or reminds me of Putin or reminds me of whoever they remind me of.
Right.
Um, and also that sometimes I think, and I was actually thinking about this, I've been working on this adaptation of A Tale of Two Cities that's going to go up in Atlanta next
Mm-hmm.
year. Um, and one of the things that I've been thinking about is, and that is exciting to me, is the way that this kind of Victorian story that's looking back at the French Revolution in some ways feels like it's totally of our moment, right? This,
Yep.
This story about a society where income inequality gets to the point where everything splits apart, and it's really scary. Um, but what's exciting to me is that watching it, you can almost feel like you're looking through a kaleidoscope where sometimes things coalesce and you feel like, oh, this is exactly this thing that is happening now, right? This is exactly like protests that are happening now. And then the narrative continues, and it's as if it kind of comes out of focus again or coalesces into something else. And what's useful about that is it makes me think about the then and it makes me think about the now, as opposed to just sort of saying, well, this is this, X equals X. That's not a very interesting algebra problem.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but something that makes me hear both sort of consonance and dissonance is to me a worthwhile way to spend an evening.
So this leads me to another opera. I didn't think I'd be going there next, but of your five you gave me, one of them was Wozzeck by Alban Berg.
Yeah.
And I should say to you up front, her name me your, they may name a few, but one of the ones they always name is Wozzeck. Arthur Miller's, I did a panel with Arthur Miller in 1999, And I asked him away from the stage, I said, I bet I know your favorite opera. He said, no, you don't. I said, it's Wozzeck, right? And he said, yes, it is Wozzeck.
Uh-huh.
And playwrights love Wozzeck, and you listed Wozzeck as one of your five. How come?
The reason I listed it is that so Wozzeck, which is this play from I don't know if I think it's the early 19th century by George
The
Buchner, before he was
1830s.
1830s, right?
Yeah.
Um, that exists only in fragments and exists as a series of unordered scenes, right? So you can kind of impose a most logical plot structure on these scenes, but we don't actually know in what order this play was assembled. I think what I find most interesting about it is just sort of seeing this one particular ordering of this really open text and sort of getting, and also actually, I think, and this relates a little bit to what we were saying about Don Giovanni and the way that music, kind of mandates a certain way through a text, right? That you're seeing this text that when you read Wojciech the play, it's so open and sometimes so strange and sort of hard to figure out how A relates to B. And there's something really exciting about seeing this particular attempt, and maybe there's something about the kind of totalizing factor of music that adds to sort of the precision of the attempt, right? It's not just reading somebody's adaptation script where they've said, I've ordered the scenes in this way, but it's really hearing a vision of this text that if you're a playwright, and that well, you both know and you're often really puzzled by. And so it's really nice and fun to see how somebody else has worked through the puzzle.
So a few things to add about that. The playwright was Georg Buchner.
Yeah.
And when at the University of Wisconsin, we had to read all the plays ever written practically. Professor Elwood was the one who taught us Wozzeck. And he was very clear about the fact that although the fragments that Buchner left because he died are what they are, and it was unfinished, there was an editor who came along about 40 years later in the 1870s who put together a sort of play version of Wozzeck, the play, but it didn't premiere until 1913.
Right.
And it was seen by Alban Berg, the composer of the opera, in 1914 in Vienna. And he immediately thought, this is an opera. So therefore, what we had was a play that only had its premiere a year before. And World War I came along. And this is the story of a soldier who, depending how you interpret it, is abused, abuses others, perhaps both, is cruel to a woman with whom he has a child.
May kill her.
He may kill her. It's misery from start to finish. And, in some productions, he is humiliated physically by a doctor. It's very upsetting. And this is 1913, based on the 1820s and 30s. And therefore, Buchner came out of the European wars of the early 19th century and reflected that in his play. And then it was updated basically to World War I. The fact that Alban Berg saw it just as the First War was breaking out, and he was in Vienna, and this was the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, we couldn't help but think of him. He became a corporal in the Austrian army, as writing almost something autobiographical about the experience of having gone through war, just the way we have the famous British poets who wrote in World War I about their experience of war. This is a much more in-your-face way of approaching the horrors of war. And not only what it does to the soldier, but what it does to society, and how it enables or it fosters cruelty and the sense of, I've been in this for myself, kind of like Mother Courage in Brecht later on, who basically does everything she can to survive and to keep her kids alive. It's the same thing in Wozzeck. and except that the main characters all meet a sad end. And I told you I had a relative who was who sang with Ethel Merman before going into Gypsy.
Hmm.
My cousin Alice played Marie's Child in the Metropolitan Opera premiere of Wozzeck,
Oh,
and
wow.
therefore Wozzeck was my first opera when I was a tot, because I was taken as a family excursion to see this. And the
What did you
reason,
make of it at that age?
I had no comprehension. I'd never been to
Yeah.
an opera.
Yeah.
I'll tell you the version of the story, not the whole version. I sat in row C with my dad, and I couldn't understand the music. I couldn't understand the story. I'd never been in the glorious old Metropolitan Opera House. And in front of me, in front of my dad, was a tall, balding man. And in front of me was a very pretty lady. And I knew that at 3 years old, that this is a pretty lady. And um, she caressed my cheek. She was fabulous, is all I can say. So my memory of that night was the pretty lady and the curtain calls and the applause and the sound of the applause. The opera had no effect on me because I was too young.
Hmm.
Fast forward to 1999 in Chicago, and I said to Arthur Miller, "Were you at the Met premiere of Wozzeck seated in row B with Marilyn Monroe?" He said, "Yes." I said, "I was behind you." He said, "You were the little boy who sat still the whole time, and Marilyn Monroe caressed your cheek." So I mention this only because what we experience when we go to the theater, to opera, whatever, is different from one person to the next.
Yeah.
And my memory was a woman, I had no idea that it was Marilyn Monroe, and she knew that obviously I didn't have a clue. And what Marilyn Monroe thought of the opera Wozzeck, I will never know. I know that Arthur Miller was profoundly influenced by that.
Hmm.
And my father, it was his favorite opera. We have a relative in our family who was named Albin, or Albin Berg. That's how
Hmm.
much it is part of our family. But back to the opera Wozzeck, it's an opera in which the composer did the libretto for the most part.
Yes.
He
Yeah.
adapted a little bit of words from elsewhere, but basically he did it. So he could structure it the way Wagner and Berlioz would structure their operas, where the librettos suited their dramatic intention. It
Yeah.
has 15 scenes in 3 acts, but they're very fast, kind of like Don Giovanni. It's
Yeah.
done in one long sit of 90 minutes, and each of the 3 acts has 5 scenes. And they are, as you said, sort of a jumbled narrative that he could have been. There were scenes from the life and death of Wozzeck. And therefore, it's impressionistic. It is a collage. And I always wonder whether, if we moved one scene to a different place, how that would affect our perception of the opera. I don't think we should. But
No.
clearly, Berg had an understanding of what he wanted in terms of how the scenes move forward. And also, very important, and I want to ask you as a playwright about this, there are moments when words don't suffice. And Berg, who did his own libretto, had these incredibly wrenching, magnificent musical passages that separated one scene from the next, so that we as an audience member would do the emotional transition from what has occurred and what we're about to see. Do you, when you write words for a libretto, consider where the music might go beyond your words?
Yes, I do. And I think I even consider it when I write not for a libretto, in the sense that you sort of think that often the words are pointing at something that is maybe beyond the language, or that is existing, to go back to what we keep talking about, in the imagination of the individual audience member that you're trying to awaken. But yeah, I do. I mean, I think that one of the things that I really think about, right, is that if the words and the music sort of line up exactly, or mean exactly the same thing, or indicate the same thing, it can kind of feel like you've made a sandwich where you just put butter on butter, or you just put jam on jam, or
I
and
have no problem with butter on butter.
no, I don't either.
Jam on jam is overkill, but butter on butter is
Butter on butter is pretty
good.
good. Yeah, that is very true. um but where you don't want redundancy, right? And I certainly don't feel in my playwriting or in my libretto writing that I always get it right. And sometimes you look back at things and you sort of say, oh, you know what, I kind of put in too much there, right? It's a little purple, or it's just not quite right. But I think that is sort of an important or an exciting part of the challenge, is figuring out what is the exact right amount, and another cooking metaphor might be it's like the dash of lemon in the cream sauce, right? That kind of makes the whole thing pop. And if you don't have that, it's sort of flat. And so I think that you're always looking at that. And I think that's true in production too, to go back to our conversation about design, right? You want the scenery or the lights or the costumes to bring something that isn't existing in the language. And I think that's one of the reasons that sometimes Shakespeare on film doesn't work all that well, is because almost everything exists in the language, right? Everything that everybody is doing, everything that everybody is thinking, everything that you're supposed to see is described in that beautiful language. And so then you're watching this movie where you're sort of hearing what you're seeing, and you have this sense of redundancy that you want to avoid.
Can you name me a film or two based on Shakespeare that you think works?
I think the Julie Taymor Titus Andronicus works.
Yeah.
I really enjoy that movie.
It was bloody.
But yeah, I mean, you're very bloody. It's very bloody.
It's hard to unsee some of the things that we see in that movie.
It is. And speaking about cooking metaphors, you're not. It maybe doesn't make you want to cook when you're done.
No.
No. But actually, the new Joel Cohen Macbeth with Frances McDormand,
I've not seen. I know, and Denzel Washington, which I've not seen. Yeah.
I think it's really good, and it's really interesting. They did it all on sound stages, and so there's something about the control, and it's in black and white, and so there's something about the control that he has over the lighting that really harkens back to sort of early cinema, to black and white cinema that's all done indoors, and it lends itself beautifully to the material, I thought.
I happen to like some of the very old 1930s productions of Shakespeare plays. One of my least favorite Shakespeare on film, one of my least favorite Shakespeare plays, and shoot me now, is A Midsummer Night's Dream.
On film or at all?
Anywhere. Huh. That's where my fantasy stops. But there is a very charming version from the 1930s that's sort of set in a garden and has Olivia de Havilland and Mickey Rooney, and it works. And the sort of 1930s, I'm guessing Warner Brothers production style is very enchanting, because the actors bring enchantment, which is something that play labors and perspires to make you feel in other circumstances, and I'm just not enchanted. So although I hate questions such as this, I'm going to ask it to you anyway. Do you have a favorite Shakespeare play?
Gosh, that's a great question. I don't know if I have. So I directed a production of Julius Caesar with 8th graders, and for that reason, I have a great fondness for that play, and seeing them engage with that material and really wrap their minds around the political questions in that play, and the questions about ambition, and also the questions about whether your friends have your best interests at heart, which is a great question when you're in 8th grade. And also and also just because we had a really wonderful time doing that, and we made a fake blood pack for Caesar that when the stabbing happened, blood sprayed everywhere and everybody yelled and the kids were really excited. And so I think for that reason, I have a real soft spot for that Shakespeare play.
In our modern times, did you run into any kind of objections from parents or school board or anything enacting a play that deals with these, quote, adult themes? I don't mean sexual, but I mean political violence, all that.
No, not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. Good. This was at a small private school in Massachusetts where I taught, and actually where I met my wife. But no, I think the parents were really excited.
Good.
about the show. And one of the things that I loved doing was just teaching the kids how to scan the lines, how to look at where the syllable counts were, and sort of teach them that if they were able to relax into those iams, then a lot of the acting would take care of itself, and a lot of the meaning would take care of itself. And so I think the parents were just kind of happy to see their kids go home and be
Yeah.
counting out these Shakespeare syllables, as opposed to what you worry that your adolescents are going to do.
Well, number one, God bless Massachusetts. Number two, I mean it. It's my second
Yeah,
favorite state, and often it's my favorite.
yeah.
Um, but number two, because I never sleep, was recently reading a conversation with Dame Judi
Mm,
Dench, about where she knows to breathe and how she phrases in Shakespeare. And she said, he gives it all to you. You look at the
yeah,
punctuation, because
yeah,
if there's a half line, that's where you pause. This is
yeah,
where you breathe. Everything in Shakespeare comes out of his being an actor and the acting tradition, and his knowing how the line should flow. So that when we superimpose a stentorian Shakespearean style, to be or not
yeah,
to be, it's awful. It's
yeah.
stultifying. It's boring. So my favorite Shakespeare play, when I ask people to guess it,
Mm,
no one ever guesses it. And it's not an obscure play. It's not Pericles or something like that, or
yeah.
even Timon of Athens, which is a play I do like. Um, and when after 15 guesses, when no one gets it, and then I tell them my favorite play, they say, "Oh, yeah, I forgot about that one."
Huh.
And to me, it's his greatest play.
Can I guess
I'll
it?
give you three guesses. Go ahead.
Okay. Coriolanus.
No.
Um, I guess that one, because that often gives me the sort of Agrippina feeling of not knowing who to empathize with, and
Right.
all that. Henry V.
No. I like Henry V very much.
Me too. I
And
really
I would
love it.
say that Julius Caesar is my third favorite of all the Shakespeare plays.
Okay.
Romeo and Juliet being my second favorite, but that because of the language, not the story. I think it's the
Uh-huh.
most beautiful language in Shakespeare is Romeo and Juliet, but it's not my number one.
Gosh. I don't know why I want to say Henry II, but I do.
No, I like it. No, no,
Uh-huh.
it's not any kind of British story.
Uh-huh.
Antony and Cleopatra.
Oh, yes. Makes
Yeah, of
total
course.
sense.
That's what everyone says. Of course.
Yeah, that makes, I don't know why I didn't think about that.
One
Yeah.
of the greatest female characters in Shakespeare, someone
Yes.
who really holds the stage with the men,
Yes.
a fascinating male character. Um, Romeo and Juliet for grown-ups, Macbeth
Yes.
without the sickness,
Yes.
without the insidious nuttiness of that family,
Yeah.
but incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
And a woman who takes her destiny in her own hands, which is very operatic.
Yeah. Well, I was going
And
to say it's a lot like, I mean, that play really approaches the magnitude of opera, I think.
that may be part of why I love it. It's
Yeah.
also because the single greatest Shakespearean performance I've ever seen, and I've seen it in three different productions, was Vanessa Redgrave as Cleopatra.
Mm,
Was just astonishing. So when you see what that role can be when put in the hands of that actress
yeah.
at different phases of her life, and in one of the productions, her Anthony was the man she was romantically involved with, so it had a very erotic charge in a
Hmm.
way that two other productions didn't, but were still great. And she
Yeah.
played the role differently every time. It's not a surprise to me that Samuel Barber picked that opera to create the opera for, I mean, that play to create the opera for the opening night of the new Met, starring Leontine
Right.
Price and Justino Diaz. Um, and wonderful though I think that opera is, it was much improved when it was revised for Chicago with Catherine Malfitano. Barber improved it,
Hmm.
and it's a very playable, good work now that had been crushed by the Zeffirelli production at the opening. But nonetheless, it has everything I want in a play in an opera.
Mm.
And because I can you name me another Shakespearean woman who achieves that level of I don't want to say greatness, but ability to hold the stage and be at the center. Lady Macbeth in her way.
Yeah, well, maybe grandeur more than greatness almost.
Grandeur, yeah, but also self-determination. Lady Macbeth has
Yeah,
a terrific breakdown.
right.
But Cleopatra, it's more, she's like Dido. It
Yes.
has a very
Oh, for
different
sure.
flavor to me,
Yeah.
and one that I find very appealing because I love Berlioz's Les Troyens as one of my favorite operas. So therefore,
Mhm.
the whole story of Dido and Aeneas. Let's move from Wozzeck to the next one. We have two more.
Yeah.
Um, Another magnificent opera, Tchaikovsky's Eugene Onegin. As I said to you in my book, Opera 101, I picked 11 operas, and two of them, Don Giovanni and Eugene Onegin, are ones I teach.
Hmm.
And I use Onegin to teach about love in opera. People thought I would use La Boheme or something else. But
Hmm.
Onegin, because the way signals are missed, or the way if the person that you really should be with, he or she, or he and he, or she and she, whatever combination, is not ready at the right moment, or circumstances outside of you are not ready for that moment, it doesn't happen. And
Yeah.
then one can live a life of regret. Now, in this particular case, it was a story that every Russian knew, if they could read or even not, of Eugene Onegin by Alexander Pushkin. And he wrote the play, the novella, and it then mirrored his own life because he died in a duel, a shooting duel. That is what happened to Lenski in the novella and in the opera. So, if in the 1830s, I believe I'm guessing, um, this was published by Pushkin and then he died in a duel, and then in the 1870s, 1879, Tchaikovsky undertakes to tell the story, it's no longer just about Lenski, the character in the opera. It's about the writer Pushkin. And by
Right.
extension, it's about Tchaikovsky's relationships with women, Tchaikovsky's concept of romance, Tchaikovsky's daring to basically take on the great Russian novel, or one of them. War and Peace would be others, but basically, this is one of the big ones, and tell a story that everyone knew. And initially, he resisted that. And he resisted it also because, and I wrote this down to be sure I got it right, um, the book was in 389 14-line stanzas, so 5,446 lines. And Tchaikovsky selected enough of these lines to suit his opera, but not using all the lines. But he used Pushkin's language much more than a librettist would use the
Yeah.
language of an original source material, unless you're Debussy and Pelléas and Melisande. But for the most
Right.
part, you rewrite the story, except Tchaikovsky did something a little different. He took 7 scenes, it's episodic, from the life and story of Eugene Onegin, Lenski, and Tatiana, the woman who was in the middle of all this. I think it's fair to say that Tchaikovsky identified more with Tatiana than with Lenski or with Onegin. Maybe you disagree.
I no, I don't disagree. I also feel like I am totally unqualified to conjecture.
Okay.
Um, but no, I don't disagree at all. Yeah, and I one thing that I love, so that of all the libretti on my list, that's the one that I don't speak any Russian.
Nor do
And
I.
so in some ways it's the one that I have the least access to, right? I don't speak Italian, but I speak French. So if I'm seeing Don Giovanni, I know what some of the words are. I know what some of the gist is. And with Eugene Onegin, other than the super titles, I have no access to what is being
Right.
said.
Nor do
Um,
I.
but I've still had this experience when I've seen that opera performed of a sort of psychological precision in the way that the music and the words, which I don't understand, but the dramatic scene, the structure, the events are interacting and really sort of have this both the sense of I don't know, kind of detail, psychological detail that you feel when watching a play, watching something like an Ibsen play or a Chekhov play, and the kind of grandeur that you feel when you're seeing an opera or when you're listening to Tchaikovsky music. And I don't even know enough about that libretto or about Russian to know how that particular work is managing to do that. But it's something that I actually am not sure that I've really experienced in that many other capacities as a viewer.
Well, I think again, like Berg, we have Tchaikovsky doing the libretto and composing music that suits his concept of the libretto.
Right.
We have Berg doing 15 random scenes that tell the story kaleidoscopically of Wozzeck and Marie and the others. We have 7 scenes that are much more prolonged, let's say, because it's longer opera and it's only 7 scenes, not 15 like Wozzeck. But we also have Tchaikovsky going very deep psychologically.
Yes.
And we know that the first thing he did when he thought to compose an opera on Eugene Onegin was compose the letter aria, the 15-minute or so scene in which Tatiana, the young Tatiana, pours out all of her feelings for this slightly older 26-year-old charismatic, handsome man that she's met from the city where she's a girl from the country. And he disdains her for being, rustic and, not his type of city girl, so to speak. And only years later, when he sees her in St. Petersburg and decides she's quite something, she's beautiful, she's refined, she's elegant, everyone loves her, that, gee, maybe I messed up. And maybe this was, and he's already shot Lenski, who was the intended of Tatiana's sister. It all went bad. And it was all because of the callow nature of Eugene Onegin. I find it interesting that Don Giovanni and Eugene Onegin, and I would also say Carmen, are characters who are anti-heroes, who are title characters in opera. Because Onegin is the cause of the upset for Tatiana and Lenski and others. But I don't think you could really say that we fall in love and identify with and care about what happens to Onegin.
No.
And maybe with Don Giovanni, we care because he's so charismatic. Onegin is, he's a cooler customer, in a way.
Yeah.
And I find that interesting. And I find his ambivalence to mirror Tchaikovsky's ambivalence about his own role in society. And not I've done a lot of research. I recently did a lecture on Tchaikovsky, not because he was gay, that was not the issue, but because he was very westernized. He had a French-speaking mother. He was very drawn to Europe. He was drawn to Paris, to the finer things. He loved Italy and so on. He loved Mozart in a very particular way, and he created a piece called Mozartiana that was his tribute to Mozart.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, Mozartiana. He did it 100 years after something that Mozart did. I don't know whether it was Don Giovanni or it was 100 years after something. Tchaikovsky wrote a tribute to Mozart called Mozartiana. But because his being gay in the West was not overly an issue, I don't subscribe to the theory that he committed suicide. There was a lot of bad water in Russia and a lot of people died of cholera. And I find that Tchaikovsky suffers from the prejudices of the biographers and the centuries that he lived in, after he lived, when there were different views of sexuality and so forth. Happy, I wouldn't necessarily say he was a happy-go-lucky guy. He was not Rossini.
No, no, and the music isn't either. I mean, you hear it.
Although Rossini was a famous depressive, but that's for another time. Rossini suffered from real depression, but you wouldn't know that from the music. Donizetti, the same. It's the same feeling, but Tchaikovsky is a lot more sophisticated and complex than we give him credit for. And I don't want to burden him with the biographers from 1910 and 1930 who said out of desperation for being, quote, homosexual, he killed himself. I don't see that. Philip Bullock, is someone I recently had on my program about Rachmaninoff, who wrote a very interesting biography of Tchaikovsky that I think captures him in a more balanced way. So I recommend that to people. But I think that what I love, many things I love about the opera Eugene Onegin, is that Tchaikovsky captures the feelings of all the characters, down to the smallest ones. Monsieur Triquet, who is a Frenchman, bringing a little bit of French nostalgia and culture to the Russian setting. The grandmother, the mothers, the sister, everyone's reaction. You could hear it in their music and you could feel it in their text. These were all people who, in one way or another, were reacting to Tatiana or Lenski, or in different ways Onegin. And I think it's a masterpiece of a libretto, and it's quite an achievement because he was primarily a composer, but nonetheless, the libretto, which he drew largely from Pushkin, but he knew what to pick. And it's apparently somewhat in the spoken form that we would find in the Pushkin, is quite remarkable. I don't speak Russian, as I said, but this is based on research. So this leads me to the final of your very diverse operas, many centuries. Another excellent opera by John Adams and Alice Goodman, Nixon in China. Now, how did that make the list?
Well, so that made the list. It's an opera that I feel a real fondness for, in part because when I had my first libretto writing job, my first libretto writing commission, and it was for an opera in English, I realized that I better look at some operas in English. And because sometimes I find that when I'm going to the opera, actually having distance from the language that's being spoken, either, being able to understand it as a second language, or if it's, Russian, not being able to understand it at all, somehow helps me. I sort of like that sense of distance, and it makes me accept that everybody is singing, and that there's this orchestra and all of the conventions that go with opera. And sometimes if I see opera in English, I have more sort of initial resistance to those conventions. And so I started to look for operas in English, and I would get them out of the scores out of the Yale Music Library. I was a graduate student in playwriting at the drama school at that point. And so, I got out Peter Grimes, and I got out Nixon in China, and then I would listen to the music and follow along with the orchestral score and look at the words that were underneath. And I think there were a couple of things that really appealed to me about that opera. One was the way that the music and the text interacted, and just feeling, actually in a way that relates to what we were saying about Shakespeare, that so much of sort of the rhythms of English and the rhythms of the words were either reflected in or played with by the music. So it really felt like music and language and sort of the rhythm of language were paying attention to each other, we're talking to each other. And then the other thing I think that I sort of like and find really interesting about that opera is the way that it goes from I don't know even quite how you would describe it, from the sort of the almost sort of mundane, sort of statecraft mundane, right, of, Nixon delivering his remarks when he gets off the airplane in China.
But actually, it starts with a chorus.
Yes. It starts with the chorus. Yes. Singing about the snow and the fields. And yeah. But then what I was going to say is that you have those moments of the mundane, but you also have those moments of the chorus that are quite abstract and poetic, or of, Pat Nixon singing about this dream that she's had with the Statue of Liberty. And there's something about the way that it sort of slides from verisimilitude to the kind of poetic that feels like it just is really nicely about how that opera is interrogating in a way myth, and the way that sort of history becomes myth, and kind of the intersection between what we know for sure, right, which is, Nixon got off this plane and said whatever it was that he said, and these things that kind of exist on another register, either in the voices of these individual people like Pat Nixon, or in, like you're saying, this chorus, right, that sort of begins with this almost poem of landscape is my
Yeah.
memory of the beginning of that opera. And I just really felt like it worked. I really was interested in all of the different ways that it was kind of sliding around and toggling between these different modes.
There was a production in April of 2023 of this opera at the Paris Opera, which I
Mm,
wish I could have seen, with my friend Thomas Hampson as Nixon, which
mm,
would have been worth the price of admission, with Renee
yeah,
Fleming as Pat Nixon. Um, to me, that's magnificent casting.
yeah,
I find the opera interesting because there are six basic characters. Three of them represent America. In other words, Nixon, Mrs. Nixon, and Henry Kissinger, who was not born in America, but was Secretary of State or National Security Advisor. Chairman Mao, Madam Mao, his wife, a formidable figure,
yeah,
and Chou En-lai. And Chou En-lai is sort of the Kissinger character, but much more subtle and cunning, in a good way, cunning, I would say, than the overt and Machiavellian Kissinger.
yeah.
This is very much a political opera.
Oh, yeah.
Um, I think also it's notable that Act Three bears a strong resemblance to the Mozart da Ponte operas because
Mm,
suddenly after the solos there are ensembles,
yeah,
and it begins with the chorus. It has solos where we establish the characters and duets, and then has the last act ensembles, which to me speaks to how what happens in the story, the way China and the United States tentatively begin to reach out to one another and form the bond that to this day, many years, 50 years later, is tenuous and complicated, but nonetheless inextricable in my view. And Alice Goodman, who wrote the libretto, was approached by Peter Sellers,
right.
Sellars, a Bostonian, who had this idea for doing an opera. It was John Adams' first opera. He's a wonderful composer, and this was his first. He was 40. Alice Goodman did this, and then the very controversial death of Klinghoffer
Right.
in 1991, and then stopped writing libretti. She married a British churchman, and she became Lady Hill, I think her name is, and
Yeah.
lives in
And became an Episcopal priest, I believe, or an
she's an
Anglican
Episcopal
priest.
priest, yes, and she was Jewish.
Right.
So talk about Lorenzo da Ponte. There's a trend here of
Yeah.
all these librettists, whether it's Grimani in Agrippina or Lorenzo da Ponte, who go from being Jewish or very, very secular to being religious Christians in one form or another.
Yeah.
There's
That's
a story to tell.
there is. I don't know
Onegin
what
was
it
not
is,
that
but it's
story, but
interesting.
it's very, very interesting that we would have three of your five operas would have that in common.
Yeah, you're
Um,
right.
so now I want to talk a bit about you before we conclude.
Yeah.
I know that you wrote what's called a dance opera. Would you tell me about it and what is the dance opera? I know it's performed at BAM, Brooklyn Academy of Music.
Yeah, so that's it was an adaptation of the 13th century Japanese NOH play Hagoromo, which is often sort of the no play that gets translated or presented in the West. If people are gonna if you're gonna read one, it's often the one that people end up reading, and it's the story of an angel who comes down to earth and drops the beautiful robe that allows her to fly and to be an angel on earth, and a fisherman who picks it up and won't give it back, and she basically she starts to die because she can't live without the robe, and then they strike a bargain where he says, well, if you show me the secret dances of the angels, then I will return this robe to you. Um, and she does, and then ascends to heaven. And this is read in all sorts of ways. I think one pretty classic interpretation is that it's sort of the beginning of art and art making and dance on earth, of sort of, human beauty on earth, because this divine thing has been imparted to this lonely human. And there's also a really beautiful moment where, she says, well, you need to give me the robe back for me to be able to do the dance. And he says, well, wait a second. If I give it back to you before you do the dance, you're just going to fly off. And she says, don't you understand that I'm incapable of deceit? And then he has this moment of starting to realize, what the difference is between her divine nature and his human one. And he starts to feel this shame, I think, at having thought that this robe was something that he could kind of keep and contain and own, as opposed to just sort of appreciate or be in the presence of.
And what is the length of this ballet, this dance opera?
It's probably about 70 or 80 minutes.
So I have an idea for you.
Yeah.
To do this on a double bill where this is the curtain raiser, and then after the intermission, Richard Strauss's Salome.
Wow.
There's a lot that echoes between the two.
I never thought about that, and you're right.
That's why I'm here, my friend.
Yeah.
That's why I want to do Agrippina and Poppaea together.
Yeah,
because
you're right.
sometimes the resonance, there's a lot going on between those two works. I've not seen your Hagoromo.
Yeah.
But I would love to see that as a double bill. And it's doable. Salome is 90 minutes as well.
Right. Right. Yeah, you're right. And it's two very different, but also related stories of people dancing for other people and
exactly.
Yeah, bargains around dancing.
And about exchange of garments and
yes.
faith and
yes.
trust and all that. And you are working on a chamber opera, or have you completed it? 1,000 Years of Sacred Music and Two Americans.
Yes, I am working on that. It's unfortunately it's been a little bit on hold. It was gonna go up at a seemed slated to go up at a theater in Atlanta, and we were workshopping it right before the pandemic, and then the pandemic happened, and then sort of the world changes and you don't know where things are in the queue. But that's a piece that I've been working on, and that is basically about a couple sort of having a one night stand, and then at the same time there's a countertenor kind of singing about the sort of more spiritual dimensions of this experience. And so I sort of imagine it as I don't know what, it's sort of Sam Shepard meets the Bridges of Madison County meets the St. Matthew Passion. And
I don't know if you saw the production by you should know this, by oh boy, I'm forgetting his name. Starts with a P. The recent opera at the Metropolitan Opera, The Hours, based on the play by Michael Cunningham. It was a wonderful opera starring Renee Fleming, Joyce DiDonato, and Kelly O'Hara, drawn from the book The Hours, and to some degree the film The Hours. And I mentioned this, apart from being, I really enjoyed it, was because there's a countertenor who weaves through the opera making commentary about making us feel different things through his countertenor voice. And he appears in different places and different times as a porter, as a quote a minor character, but nonetheless it's his voice that conditions how we feel about the emotions of the moment.
Oh, interesting. I will
Gregory Spears. I don't want to come up with the wrong name. I should know this off the top of my head, but The Hours, it was done in November 2022 at the Metropolitan Opera.
Yes, I've been meaning to see it actually, or at least listen to the music. So now this will push me to actually go do it.
If I were to say to you, let's do an opera, what not that I'm saying this, but if I were to, because I'm not a composer, but if I were to say this to you as a composer, what would you want to bring as a possible opera idea for you to work on with the composer?
I've often had the idea of Ethan Frome. The Edith Wharton novel.
Edith Wharton. Yeah.
A
lot of snow.
A lot of snow. A lot of snow, and
so
some
this
really
is a pre-climate change opera.
Yes, it is definitely a pre-climate
it's a memory
change opera.
piece.
Yeah, exactly. It's not about this past winter.
Right.
But I guess I'm talking about sort of imagination and where you as or we each as audience members kind of have our imagination take over from what's on the stage. I think there's something about that story, which is about this man and his wife who has a very unhappy marriage, and then I believe it's her young female cousin who comes to stay with them, and he and the female cousin fall in love. But a lot of the novel is just the sort of unbearable tension in this triangle of people as they're in this snowbound house somewhere outside of Stockbridge, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about sort of the containment and the way that it's the world of it is both, and the narrative of it is both so confined and small, and these are people of a sort of deep New England reserve, and then at the same time the emotional registers are so giant and really sort of titanic that it just feels to me like it would lend itself to music, and that you could do really interesting things with the difference between what these people are sort of showing as they're very discontentedly eating their ham and their dried beans and things like that, and then what they're feeling on the inside as they're lusting after each other, or conniving to make sure that their spouse doesn't leave them, or all of the things that are happening in that novel.
You are from New England. You're from a very old city, Newburyport, Massachusetts. New England, which is neighboring to New York State, where I live, is such a fascinating place. It's a small place geographically, but the DNA for much of our nation, and therefore the world, comes from, yes, New York City, but really New England. And even among the 6 states of New England, all of which have their own very distinct characters, it's remarkable that Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and little tiny Rhode Island could not be more different. Rhode Island is kind of like the Wild West in this little state, compared to all the other states with their different measures of sin and virtue and so on. Massachusetts having had the witches, Massachusetts being in a way the biggest state, Connecticut being the wealthiest state, very august, very skewing to tradition, whatever we think of as tradition. I'm paraphrasing Gustav Mahler now, who said the tradition is not venerating the ashes, but passing the torch. And in Connecticut, our perception of Connecticut culture is something venerating the ashes rather than passing the torch. Massachusetts is a little bit more of both. New York is very much about passing the torch. Maine is this otherworldly place full of very cantankerous people in the most gorgeous setting. New Hampshire, live free or die. They have their own philosophy. Vermont, the People's Republic of Vermont, practically socialist, taciturn farmers, but hippies and back to the land, all in a very small area. And when people travel around New England, it has produced disproportionately so much of our literature. And Charles Ives was a New Englander. New York and the adjoining area of New England is so fascinating. And when people come to America or travel in our country, yes, the Grand Canyon is magnificent. And yes, California is abundant and sexy, and Florida is Florida. And the South and its whole Gothic history and its political history and amazing cultural history, and Virginia and its veneration of the ashes, so to speak. Our country is fascinating and diverse, but the germ of much of what this country is, in good and bad, happens to be in New England. And I think that, Edward Albee set his plays, a lot of them in New England. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is basically faculty housing in Massachusetts. And it's astonishing. It's an astonishing small place that continues to Walden Pond, which is one of my foundational books, Massachusetts.
Absolutely.
It's remarkable. Final question, did you grow up in this very old town of Newburyport feeling your New Englandness? Did you come to discover it? Do you feel a New Englander?
I think so. I mean, my dad's family are all sort of longtime Vermont people, farmers and sawmill owners and that sort of thing. And so I don't know that I thought about it that much growing up, but then when you move to other places, you sort of feel, you start to realize that you are from somewhere specific.
Yeah.
As is everybody else, but you feel it when you are somewhere else. And I think you feel it even in just sort of I don't know, feeling like you're sort of going to save your plastic bags and not buy the new version of whatever it is that's for sale, and all of those sort of funny New England things that people do.
But I mean, just the flinty character of people from Maine is almost comedic
Oh yeah.
until you just, I mean, when you look, for example, the Bush family, what we think of as Texans, these are
Oh
New
yeah.
Englanders. And
Yes.
these are New Englanders who happen to find oil in Texas, but they're
Yes.
New Englanders completely. And
Absolutely.
we, except for Barbara Bush, who was from New York, but sort of adapted to New England, um, our famous actors, Katharine Hepburn and Betty Davis, New Englanders.
Yep.
Um, it's remarkable.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it is a sort of specific place. And my wife and I both now live together in New Jersey, in Lambertville, New
Yep.
Jersey, and she's a doctoral student at Princeton, which is what brought us down here.
Yep.
But we love New Jersey. We actually feel like it's in some ways the most underrated state, the state where the reputation compared to the reality is the most at odds.
It is.
Um,
But
but
that's because New Yorkers and Pennsylvanians have characterized New Jersey as being a backwater. But New Jersey, at the time of the American Revolution, was much ahead of New York in terms of doing the right thing, even ahead of Massachusetts in terms
yeah,
of doing the right thing.
yeah, it's also beautiful. I mean, lots of
It
the
is beautiful.
countryside of New Jersey is
Yeah.
is really lovely.
Yep.
Um, but
But
we're
it's New
also,
Jersey.
but it's New Jersey, right? Right. And but we're also just often struck by how different it feels from
Yes.
where we grew up.
And it's not a big distance.
No,
And
no,
that's what I want Americans and non-Americans to understand about the United States,
yeah,
that there is such diversity, but to really understand America in all of its permutations, you have to start with New England
mm-hmm.
and Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York to some degree to begin to and Virginia to begin to understand. But even that little combination of states in a small geographical zone is basically the distance from Milan to Rome,
Mm,
London to Edinburgh is, it's remarkable.
yeah,
So
that's
anyway,
true.
this has been a lovely conversation. Brendan Pelsue, you've taught us a lot about how to think about literature, how to think about libretto, how to construct a play, and what we need to bring as audience members when we attend any kind of performance. And I thank you very much.
Well, I thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
See you soon.
See you soon.
Take care.
You too.